Welcome back to the podcast and welcome back to a returning guest. This is James Kierstead. James, good to see you.
Nice to see you too, Jed. I think I might even be setting a record here. Am I the first person who's made it to 3 episodes on the Popperian podcast?
I think you might be. I have Jagdish Hadiangadi coming on just next, and he'll be 3 as well.
So, okay.
Yeah, but yeah, you're the first there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's an honor. It's a slightly undeserved honor because Popper's not my main specialism, but it's great to be here again.
He certainly seems to have been a fascination of yours in recent years, though. A lot of focus on it.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that the basic idea of is sort of 2 main ideas: falsification and rationality in science, and also the importance of open societies and democracies. I think those are really attractive ideas, and also the potential link between them. If you look at democracy as a kind of rationalism and as a kind of falsification of kind of bad governments and bad ideas, I think those are all really exciting ideas. And yeah, the more I dive into Popper, the more complicated I realize those things are. But I think he was basically along the right lines, on the right track with those things.
Well, we'll get into all that, but I might start with a broader question. So I have a recent article or chapter of yours in front of me called Education for Science and Democracy, and we're going to speak about that a bit today. But it goes through a lot of challenges within the education system. And for a number of years, I've been listening to your podcast, Free Kiwis, and reading a lot of the articles that you've been writing. And it seems that you've been at least looking at a lot of the challenges that you see within the university sector and education in general, and some of the restrictions and limitations, and the overall scene and how it might be progressing or degrading. So I might ask you a Popperian question to start with. What is that overall scene, the problem that brings you to write an article like the one I have in front of me?
Well, there's a lot to say on that topic. I mean, that article that you have in front of you, which I co-authored with Michael Johnston and Baptiste Foucault, I mean, that's about university students, but also even younger students, and how to cultivate a disposition towards things like rationalism and democracy, which in a sort of Popperian light we see as going together. But I've also been working separately on democracy and, well, free speech, especially in universities. And there the 2 things might go together, because I think we've had an erosion of internal democracy in universities, and that's part of the reasons why we're at what I would describe as something of a crisis of academic freedom and free speech at universities. And I think there is a lot of evidence now, various reports from other countries, especially in the English-speaking world, that there's a real problem. And in fact, in Great Britain, they're just about to bring in the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which seeks to kind of do something practical about this problem. I've been looking at New Zealand, because no one's done that yet. And so it's kind of nice to be a higher education researcher in New Zealand, because, there's a lot of data and a lot of things out there that no one actually has gotten to yet. So I'm seeing a lot of incidents. I'm compiling all these incidents where free speech has been threatened or violated at New Zealand universities. So I was just looking at an episode where a Chinese embassy wrote to Auckland University of Technology because they heard that there was an event commemorating the Tiananmen Square massacres. This was in 2019, obviously, which would have been 30 years since the actual massacre. And they called it off. AUT called the event off because the Chinese ambassador, or I think it was the vice consul general, seemed displeased. So that's one case. I mean, I could tell you a whole bunch of other cases. Don Brash, the former leader of the National Party in New Zealand, which is the main centre-right party, was due to give a talk. He was invited by a politics club at Massey University. The vice chancellor intervened and cancelled that talk because she disagreed with his political views. That's very clear in the emails that were released later. So I could go on and on. There's lots of cases like that. We've also had several surveys of academics, surveys of students as well. A survey of students by Heterodox New Zealand, a group of academics that I was involved in, and they all find the same thing, that there are, substantial numbers, usually minorities, usually substantial minorities, but in some cases up to half of academics who will tell you that they don't feel free, or they feel more unfree than free to discuss certain issues. And they're the usual things that people feel uncomfortable talking about in the English-speaking world at the moment. So gender and ethnicity and colonialism. In New Zealand, the really big one is actually the Treaty of Waitangi, which was a treaty between some Maori tribes, many Maori tribes, and the British Crown in 1840. And that's become really a kind of lightning rod for cultural issues. And so that's the event, that's the topic that the highest number of academics, up to 50%, said they didn't feel comfortable discussing. So it's a huge problem here as well, and hopefully we're going to be able to do something about it.
And I suppose with those issues that you see there, I'm looking at your article in front of me here, and I imagine that what you're noticing here is a complete lack of Popperian fallibilism. at least, or at least a lack of provisionalism, the idea that uh, there is no end. As soon as you call an end to scientific discovery or discovery of knowledge or truth in any way, you've exited the game in a certain sense. And I
That's
suspect,
right. Yeah, I think certainty is a real problem in these cases. Of course, there are certain propositions which are more probable. There are certain bodies of work which have more evidence behind them, but we have a very bad record as a species, really, of getting that right and deciding that we're completely right about this thing and that nothing we say about this particular topic is wrong. All the evidence is in, and we've seen that in the past. People were persecuted for having atheist beliefs or the wrong kinds of Christian beliefs, or if they're in Muslim countries, maybe the wrong kind of Muslim beliefs. But we do this time and time again, and we never seem to learn that the problem is really just the certainty and the inability to kind of be flexible in your thinking and be open to falsification. And I think this is a really important point that Popper made. I mean, again, we'll go into that in more detail, what exactly he meant by falsification. But I think he was sort of broadly along the right lines. Like I think often with Popper, it's the starting intuition that he gets completely right. And I was re-listening to some of the Popperian podcast's previous episodes, and the one with Martin Boudry is really interesting when he talks about pseudosciences and how these immunizing strategies that he talks about, and also Popper talks about too, he uses the same term, immunizing strategies, that basically, if you're a believer in homeopathy or something, if people bring up objections to that, usually the mark of pseudoscience is that people really kind of double down and they don't take any kind of evidence that seems to go against their thesis as real. So they have all these ways of kind of getting around them. They say, well, oh, you would say that because you hate homeopathy. And or Boudry, I think, was talking about psychotherapy as well, or Freudian psychoanalysis. He was saying Freud had this brilliant way of getting around criticism, or psychoanalysis kind of generated this way of getting around criticisms that people would say, well, the unconscious idea doesn't seem like a very good one. And then, of course, you could always say, well, that's because your unconscious is, you have something that's unresolved in your unconscious that's telling you that. And I see this time and time again on the contemporary university campus. It's very common that, people will make an objection to the theory that we're all racist, say, our society is fundamentally anti-Maori, for example. And an academic or student will say, well, maybe we should look at surveys of what people actually say when you ask them, what do you think about Maori and rates of intermarriage? All these things actually seem to show that maybe there's still problems, but things are headed in the right direction. And often the response you get in the contemporary university will be something like, well, worst case scenario, sort of investigation or sacking or whatever. But more often it's just something like, well, you would say that you're a racist. And I think that's a classic sort of immunizing strategy, right? Because it absolves you of the responsibility of actually looking at the evidence, and it gets you out of the need to actually question whether the evidence, supports your thesis or whether it actually might falsify your thesis.
Why do you think people do that as a general? I mean, I did think that episode with Boundary was really important. I plan on doing another one with him some point soon. In fact, he had a really interesting talk recently where he was talking about academic freedom. And as irony would have it, in Amsterdam, they cancelled the discussion because of comments he made about something completely irrelevant. They were talking about climate change and biology, and he'd made references to the war in Gaza, and they cancelled it over that. But I wonder why people do that. Are they just simply, in your opinion, or from what you've seen, are they uncomfortable with this contest of ideas and things like this? Because surely we all we have this theory in our mind that most people they want truth. They want to be correct. You don't want to sit in error. But as soon as you invoke these immunizing strategies and you create these ad hoc theories to save your theory from refutation, you're in a sense deliberately moving away from your chance to get to truth. So why do you think most people do this?
Yeah, well, I think there's various things in our human nature. I mean, I think that we must have some kind of inclination towards the truth. Otherwise, we wouldn't have survived. We're the product of genes that have been selected, and probably if there were genes that selected for just being completely kind of in cloud cuckoo land the whole time, they wouldn't have survived. So, we have some kind of inclination towards finding out the truth, but we also have other inclinations as a species. I mean, one of them might be to group together with others of our tribe. And all of these things sort of limit, I think, the sort of truth-finding inclination. And so I think it is actually quite common for humans to sort of double down and think, well, you say you're trying to find out the truth and you're trying to help me find out the truth, but actually you're criticizing me, and that means that you're against me, or maybe there's some other markers besides opinion, like dress or whatever, that make me think you're in the other tribe. And so then there's also these strong inclinations to kind of, um, you know, towards social solidarity, I suppose we might say. And I think that's one of the key ones that's operating on campuses at the moment. It's very much, I think, that ideas that are marked as, well, often right wing or religious or whatever, they don't really get the time of day in the same way, because they're sort of labeled as kind of inherently inimical to the, what people now think of as the values of the university, which isn't so much truth finding, it's more sort of social justice, or a particular idea of social justice.
It's been heavily documented. People see it on the news a lot, at least people talking about a climate of fear on campuses. Have you seen that as well? So the idea that many of these people are not just that they're uncomfortable with discussing certain issues, but it's more that they know exactly how they feel about a certain issue, or they know exactly what the criticism of a certain position should be. But they're just simply being hushed into silence by what is in most cases a minority of people. So the majority of you has been hushed into silence simply because they don't want the backlash and the problems and all the hardship that might come from it.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I do see a lot of evidence of that. I mean, it's actually amazing, how many people get in touch with you if you speak out in a very kind of minor way. I mean, I don't think I've been particularly brave or particularly prominent, but even just sort of writing articles that go against the grain in New Zealand, a lot of academics will email you and say, well done for writing that article. I wish I could say something like you. And sometimes they'll be senior to me in academic life. And then I'll think, well, why don't you say something?
Yeah.
And it's another question of like how much of this is just cowardice and how much of it is something particular about the academic job market. I think that does actually play a huge role. It's just much more competitive than it used to be. It's much harder to find a sort of secure job. And so people are scared for that reason. I think that's the main reason that people talk about, actually, when they don't, I mean, we have to keep these things in perspective. Nobody is afraid of getting taken to the gulag or, taken out and shot, as they may have been in Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia. So that's not the situation we're in. But it's definitely the case that people are scared of losing their academic careers, which they've often. The other feature of academic careers is that you put a lot of work into it, and even just to get in at an entry level, right? You have to do several years of grad school and probably have a pretty good degree to start with. So I do see a lot of that fear, and yeah, and that's and I think social scientists have studied this pretty extensively. That there are all these mechanisms that go into this. That you're not going to speak up because you assume that everybody else disagrees with you because you don't hear what they're saying because they're too afraid to speak up. So, I mean, this is something Timur Kuran talks about in this classic article about Eastern European communist regimes, that, you see everybody else with a poster of Ceausescu or the dictator in their shop, and you think, well, they all love Ceausescu. Am I the only one who hates him? If I'm the only one who hates him, if I criticize him, then I'm going to be on my own. And actually, everyone with the poster of Ceausescu in their shops, they also hate Ceausescu. They just feel like everyone else has a poster of Ceausescu in their shop, so they got to put the poster up, right? So it's something similar, but again, I want to keep this in perspective. It's not Eastern European communism, but it's some of the same mechanisms that are happening at a lower level.
Before I did the Popperian podcast, I did a podcast on Korea, on the two Koreas. And there's a significant, I read a number of stories of family members in North Korea who defected at different times, so abandoned their families at different times, met up in South Korea, and then suddenly were face to face with this idea that we both disbelieved exactly what was going on, but we never mentioned a single word to each other inside the household. And they never had it's not so much courage, but they never had the freedom to speak until they're outside of the country itself. But let's talk about, you mentioned Martin Boundary. It's a good segue into falsificationism and the demarcation criteria. So I might open that up to you as just exactly what that demarcation is. Many Popperians have this, I guess, a certain crude view of these things. So please take us there.
Well, okay, there's many different places which to start. Maybe because you brought up the demarcation problem, let's start with that. So the demarcation problem is, I think one thing that Popper drew attention to, and it was very seminal, salutary, sort of started a lot of conversations about that in the philosophy of science, which, by the way, I'm not a philosopher of science, so I'm going to have to get you, and hopefully your listeners will be generous towards what I'm saying, but I'm just trying to work through these issues. So the demarcation problem is basically what's the difference between science and non-science. It has several other forms that we can talk about. I think Boudry talks about a normative form of it. What's the difference between good science and less good science, or a descriptive form of it. One thing, so the reason that one of the reasons we're talking today, I wanted to come back on, is that Brian Boyd at the University of Auckland, who's writing a biography of Popper, he has been finding lots of material in the archives, and whenever I'm curious about something, I write to him, and he gives me a huge amount of really interesting material. So he sent me a lot of stuff about demarcation problem and falsification in particular that I've been reading through. So one thing that struck me about that material is when it comes to demarcation problem, one thing Popper wants to make clear is that he is not talking about the difference between nonsense and meaning, or he's not talking about the difference between statements which are just nonsensical and statements which have meaning. And that's important because it distinguishes him from the logical positivists, right? So he's often identified with the sort of Vienna Circle and early on in his career, and that's correct in many ways, but he seems very keen in a lot of this material to say, I'm not doing what A.J. Ayer or another sort of typical logical positivist is doing. I'm not trying to define what makes a sentence meaningful. So you may recall Ayer and other logical positivists saying that a statement is meaningful if it makes an empirical claim, I think, or an analytical claim. So an analytical claim being kind of like a tautology, so, a bachelor is unmarried. The fact being unmarried is in the definition of the word bachelor. So that's an analytic claim. And then you have these sort of synthetic empirical claims that they're meaningful because you can test them. And I think Hume says, it's either one or the other. Anything else, you have to kind of commit to the flames. But once you get into logical positivism, I mean, early Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, Popper talks about as well. And in the Tractatus Logico, Logico Philosophicus, Wittgenstein seems to also be doing this thing where he's trying to basically demarcate propositions which are meaningful, which kind of map onto reality, and things which are sort of mystical. And it's interesting in that because Wittgenstein does seem to have some time for these mystical ideas, but he ends the work by saying, what is it? Wovon man nicht sprechen kann, darüber muss man schweigen. That whereof we cannot speak, we must pass over in silence. So you might think that's where Popper is going, and actually, I think that there's bits of his writing where he seems to be kind of latching on to that part of Wittgenstein. But then later on in his career, he talks about the myth that Popper was doing what the logical positivists were doing, and that he tried to use falsification as something to demarcate meaningful statements. So it seems like he gets criticism later on in his career. People start to say, oh, this Popper guy, he thought that falsification could demarcate, sentences which were meaningful. That's all wrong. And so he's very keen to say, no, that's a complete myth. My falsification criterion, my idea that falsification had something to do with the demarcation problem, it had nothing to do with meaning and nonsense. It's just to do with science. So that's important for him.
So what is left out on the other side of Popper's demarcation here? The obvious targets are people like Freud often, but who is left out? What type of science is left out, and why are they left out?
All right. This is kind of what Baudry was talking about, I suppose. He was talking about sort of modern pseudosciences that you're saying sort of all philosophers of science nowadays agree that things like homeopathy and astrology were pseudoscience. In this material that I've sort of looked back at in Popper, he's more talking about Freud. He's quite interested in psychoanalysis. He thinks that's not falsifiable. Marx as well, so certain historicist ideas in Marx about things that are inevitably going to take place and so on. The basic idea is that these things can't be tested. And so he defends scientists like Einstein and Rutherford because he thinks they're not only open towards falsification, but in many cases, he can point to experiments or episodes where their theories sort of came under attack and they were open to those attacks and they sort of came through it with flying colors. So, Einstein's relativity, I don't understand it completely, but Einstein's theory of gravity would seem to predict that, light actually bends when it goes around bodies that are massive enough like planets. And apparently, I think in the early 20th century, that was that was shown to be correct. Now, it would have been very easy to falsify that, I suppose, because you would have just had bodies that are massive enough to fulfill those parts of Einstein's theory, and the light didn't bend. So that passes Popper's tests, and I think that, that's what Baudry was coming back to, and I think that that's where Popper was pretty much right. Like it's a very good way of, it's a kind of feature of either theories or kind of communities of practice, which suggest that they are open to refutation and thus sort of more scientific, or they're kind of completely closing themselves off against any attempt to, or any possibility of their theories being false. And that then steers you down the more sort of pseudoscientific route.
Mm. And there's also degrees of falsifiability, I imagine, because in that case of Einstein, the remarkable thing he did was make this completely novel, bold prediction that he couldn't have. It's such a step beyond what we would imagine what a test would be at the time, and it suddenly makes your theory open and exposed to all these future refutations that may come. And I think many scientists they don't think they're using immunizing strategies because they think there are refutations of their theories. But I think one of the things, I will open this up to you, but one of the things that Popper was pushing for was increasing the falsifiability over time, increasing the ability for it to be falsified by seeking new novel predictions, trying to make your bold, trying to add empirical content to your theories, trying to put it in a place where it's not protected from criticism and refutation, but really exposed. And so you would imagine if it was false, it would crack pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, what you said there are degrees of falsifiability. It's almost a literal quotation. I just written down. So he's got this essay, Popper's essay, Truth, Rationality, and the Growth of Scientific Knowledge, 1961. And he talks about there are degrees of testability or degrees of the empirical content or explanatory power of theories. So he's got three formulations of this: degrees of testability or degrees of the empirical content of a proposition, or the degrees of explanatory powers of theories. I'm not going to go through all those, but I mean, the point is just that at some point in his career, this is 1961, so it's almost 30 years after the logic of scientific discovery, where he first kind of maps out some of these theories about falsifiability. Later on in his career, he's very keen to say, oh no, there are degrees of these things. So they're really kind of tendencies. And he talks a lot about sort of attitudes and dispositions towards falsifiability. And that's kind of what Baudry has concluded, I think, as well, that as Baudry says, I mean, scientists often resist the idea that their theory has been falsified. I mean, obviously, because, your theory can't just collapse the first time a result goes against it, because then we'd have to throw out every time something seemed to go against, Newtonian physics. We don't throw that out completely. You start to think, oh, I must have done my experiment wrong or something like that. But what the pseudoscientists do is that they really double down over a long period. And so, every supposed or every apparent falsification of the theory, it just gets completely ignored, or there are all these immunizing strategies. There's always a way around it, and nothing is ever sort of taken on board in that sense.
You could also accept in those cases, I imagine all of these, by adding ad hoc addendums to your theory over time, it can always be a falsifiable theory. It's just, if you're willing to add the ad hoc addendum to each time your theory and change it, then your theory it's always falsifiable and never falsified.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess that one of my interests in this was, so this is actually taking us back towards what's going on in New Zealand at the moment. But so over the past few years, we've had I think we should have had a good conversation. We haven't had that good a conversation because there've been a lot of attempts to shut one side down, but there's been a debate about Mataranga Maori. And so this is what I would call Maori traditional lore. A lot of academics would prefer the term Maori traditional knowledge, but this is kind of like a whole set of practices, including empirical knowledge of plants, but also extending into mythology and extending into song and traditional ways of doing things. There was a big controversy because a small number of scientists, 7 academics, wrote a letter to the New Zealand Listener criticizing Mataranga Maori and its inclusion in science curriculum. And so I could get into all that if you want, but I mean, I think the interesting thing for Popperians is just that this is a classic case of where the demarcation problem is really relevant. Because a lot of these kind of, well, I suppose nowadays they're dissident scientists who wrote this letter. They they said explicitly, we respect Maturanga Maori in many ways. It has lots of value. However, in the discovery of empirical truths, it is not the same as science. It's something like that. I can't be sure that's an exact quotation. But basically they said, yeah, there's lots of nice things we could say about Maturanga Maori. It's valuable in culture and in other ways, but it's not science. So that's it. They were just saying, like, they were using some kind of demarcation criterion to say, what some of us are doing is science, Maturanga Maori is not science. And of course, that throws up the whole question of, what is science and what isn't science.
That's yeah, go on, please.
I guess I was just getting into all these conversations about Maturanga Maori and science. And if you've been listening to the Free Kiwis podcast, you may have even heard some of these conversations.
I have a few,
yeah. So we talked to like Nick Matsky, for example, a really bright biologist at Auckland. And a lot of the time, Michael and I would say, well, my co-host on Free Kiwis is also co-author in that article you mentioned. We would kind of bring in Popper and say, well, what science really is falsification. And a lot of these scientists would sort of say to us, yeah, sort of. And they would often say, well, and Nick Matsky, for example, I think said, okay, we can agree to disagree. Popper is important, but, it's not just falsification. It's also really testability. So they'd often move away from Popper. And I find personally that as a humanities academic, the rare occasions when I'd have conversations about the philosophy of science, I got the strong impression that a lot of people nowadays have done philosophy of science courses, which basically say, Popper had this idea of falsification. That was a thing. That is something we've left behind. It was kind of falsified itself. And now we've got Kuhn, and we've got, more sophisticated versions of falsifications, maybe Lakatos, and we've got Feyerabend, and things are much more complicated than Popper. And I think there's probably some truth in that, but I definitely get the impression that a lot of people have been told, and I've even had people say these things to me, that, for example, quite an extreme version of the falsification thesis. For example, Popper said that science is just falsification. Popper said that what scientists do is always falsification. They always try and falsify, and that's kind of the only thing they do. And I think that, when I've gone back and read all this material that Brian collected, I got a very distinct impression that Popper himself is a lot more complicated than that, and that really he's kind of closer to what Baudry was saying than I think even Baudry suspected. I mean, I think Baudry was saying what he was doing was representing what he was doing as a kind of neo-Popperianism. But I think there's a lot more wiggle room even in Popper around some of these ideas of falsifiability than you might think. For example, when Nick Matsky said something like, okay, it's not just falsification, it's also testability. I mean, I've several times in these writings, I've come across statements along the lines of, well, here's one: all criticism of a theory is an attempt to refute it. And another point, he says, several different formulations of this, but he says several points, something like testability is a kind of falsification. So in other words, he's already kind of anticipated this sort of defense of his theory that any kind of test that you do, ultimately you can look at it as a kind of falsification.
Without putting words in Matsky's mouth here, I actually don't understand what he means by that. When he says it's not just falsification, it's testability.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, go on.
I was just going to say, many Popperians are probably familiar with this, but you'd imagine that if you test something, you're trying to falsify it. Because, the famous black swan, the white swan, Popperian, concealed of swans. So, if it passes the test, you don't get much from it, only that it's passed the test. But if it fails the test, then it's been falsified. So what does he mean, or what do other people mean when they make
I think I know what he means, because I have to, as a confession now I have to make on the Popperian podcast, which is that I was briefly kind of swayed by these arguments because I'd been exposed to them so relentlessly that ultimately I got kind of embarrassed. And really, Michael was more the one flying the flag for Popper in the Free Kiwis podcast. And I afterwards sort of said to him, maybe these other people are right. They keep saying that sort of maybe it's just testability rather than falsification. And what I was thinking was something like, I was saying to Michael, well, scientists do a lot of different things, and people who are, bona fide scholars in other fields with an empirical method, they're not just kind of trying to falsify things. For example, there are correlations. Like, people run regression analyses, right? And they say, well, this thing correlates with that, and then they try and tease out causality. So on the face of it, that's not an attempt to falsify anything, right? Or people also refer to sort of various equations like force equals mass times acceleration or something like that. Is that right? I think so. The various types of things that scientists do, they don't look like, on the face of it, an attempt just to prove something wrong, to prove a proposition wrong, right? So I think that's what they were thinking. But I think that what Popper has in mind here is just that you can redescribe these things as an attempt at falsifying some proposition, right? So the fact that, if there's a correlation between kind of level of education and, income, that in a sense falsifies the idea that there's no correlation between those two things. And that's not going to tell you everything about causation, but it's going to tell you something. And that's kind of the right spirit, that you should be looking for particular propositions that you can, I would say, I think it's sort of more natural, seems more natural at first to say, looking for evidence to support certain propositions. Of course, Popper, in a strict Popperian, would say, really, we're never looking for evidence to support. We're always looking for evidence to disprove. But those things are obviously often the sort of opposite of one another, right? So you can often redescribe these tests as attempts at refutation, as you obviously already have been doing, and you knew the whole time. But it took me a while to get back to that. So.
Well, I often stumble with Popper a lot myself as well. But I suspect what people are making the mistake in that case is they're imagining that they're just collecting data and the data is giving them a correlation without doing the Popperian thing of thinking at every time there must be a reason you're collecting that data in the first place. Right. You must have a theory at the first place to begin these things. In each case, if the data came out in a different way, there would be a falsification. It's just they're not imagining the first step of what they're doing, having a theory. Yeah,
it's complicated. With. I think that, because I'm not a scientist, but I wrote a PhD dissertation on Athenian social groups, and as I suspect, like a lot of people writing their PhDs, especially in the humanities, you don't come into it thinking, here's a proposition I want to falsify. You go into it thinking, basically, here's an interest that I find interesting. Here's a topic that I find broadly interesting. I think there are some interesting questions in this topic. I don't know what they are yet. And not only do I not know what the answers are going to be, I don't even know what the questions are going to be. And so it was kind of like that for me. However, I think still you might say something there like, the topics that are interesting are topics which you sort of intuit might generate propositions which might be kind of profitably falsified. It seems like a really unnatural way of thinking about it, but I think that is probably what's underneath. Like, I think a lot of the topics we find interesting are controversial topics, either in the ordinary sense or in a sort of more scholarly sense. They're topics which it would be kind of interesting to sort of show were more likely than we thought or less likely than we thought.
When you're doing that, your PhD and students like you in the future, a lot of the article in front of me is about the dire state that some of the students find themselves in today, where they're simply uncomfortable with hard discussions and things like this. Do you imagine? So, as I read the article, I did have a thought. There's a lot of discussion in there about how we need to educate students to have these discussions, and I wonder how you see this, because there's a certain strain in Popperian thought. It's not really Popperian; it's been popularized by David Deutsch and others since, which is the reason children are not so good at these debates or uncomfortable with these harsh discussions and this criticism is not that they haven't been taught it, but more that it's been taught out of them, because they imagine that children learn from a very young age. They pick up language quickly. So they must be doing Popperian epistemology if it's true. They must be critical if they're learning things around the world. And there's a certain imagination in people's minds where they think that the reason that we grow up and we struggle with these confrontations and we struggle with criticism is that the education system and the people around us has been so authoritarian to us and not encouraging of that criticism itself. So I wonder how you see the overall platform, seeing what you've seen recently on campuses, and whether it's a matter of education doing damage to students or just a failure of the curriculum, and we should be positively putting more
it's very complicated. In some ways, Michael Johnston, who I've been talking about, he would be a better person to answer these questions, because he's actually an educationalist. And I know that one of the things he talks about is the difference between so-called primary and secondary knowledge. The primary knowledge is the kind of thing we just sort of absorb, even outside of a formal educational context. And the most impressive example of that is language. Your first language, or maybe you have two if you're in a mixed family or something, but the first language that you acquire, your mother tongue, you acquire that kind of naturally, in inverted commas. And actually, maybe you wouldn't even need the inverted commas there. You acquire that because your brain is primed to absorb language and to recognize linguistic patterns at a certain time in a way that it's not primed to recognize other patterns, and it's extremely efficient. not everything is like that. So these secondary uh, things that you need to pick up, secondary types of knowledge, they're more things like written language actually is an example of that. Even though it's the same language, writing is not a natural skill. And I mean, that's obvious because humans didn't always have writing. You know, we invented it at a certain point. Um, so we try and get back to the second bit of your question. So that was about, you know, whether students have this kind of way of thinking about
Well,
open-mindedness and free speech
well,
taught into them.
well, I'll give you a quote. I remember speaking to Joseph Agassi, who passed away a couple of
Yeah.
years ago, and he wrote these wonderful papers about the hazard called education. And he
Okay.
said, I remember his quote in there saying, if you want to help students, the best thing you can do is get out of their way. And that was that idea that so much what we do, so much of that we do trying to help students is in fact coercing them into narrow pathways that we think are interesting rather than letting them discover interests for themselves.
It's very complicated. Like I think that, well, I think one effect of this is partly that if you're talking to people on the Popperian podcast, you know, many of whom have been in academia or, you know, they're journalists or writers, you know, we have a certain view of academia because we're usually kind of quite self-motivated and we've done quite well at school. And I think that for a lot of those types of people, freedom is actually a good thing. And we'd probably, after a certain point, we would have learned maybe an equal amount as we learned at school just by kind of going online and reading books and stuff. Most people aren't like that, I don't think. And I think that what Agassi said there, I don't know what his, I mean, I've listened to one episode with him, I think on the Popperian podcast, but I don't know if this is where he's coming from, but like, I think that there is a lot of Rousseauianism in contemporary educational theory, you know, in the sense that they just believe that there's a kind of natural goodness to human beings and maybe even a natural intelligence. And there is, like, so the language example is a good example of when there is, but that's not the case for everything. And there are lots of things that you actually need to teach human beings how to do. And this kind of links back to what we were talking about before, because I think that even though I said before that we have a natural inclination towards sort of truth finding, and that's kind of what you led with, I think actually the other inclinations that I was talking about are usually stronger. Because if you look for most of recorded human history, the truth finding element has not been to the fore. I mean, usually people have been ostracized and in some cases, you know, beaten up or tortured or killed for their beliefs. So I think it makes sense to take that as the kind of natural state. I mean, that's been the case in most human societies until the Enlightenment, with maybe some brief kind of periods where things were a bit freer, like in classical Athens. But even there, of course, they ended up forcing Socrates to drink hemlock. So I think that we do actually need to teach people these things. And I think that for most of my life, certainly through the 80s and 90s and noughties, most universities in the developed world would teach you some kind of critical rationalism. It wasn't explicitly Popperian, but it would have been something that kind of pleased Popper, you know, warmed the cockles of his heart. And I actually think that what we're seeing now with this kind of extreme progressivism on a lot of Anglophone university campuses is a kind of revanchist movement, which is a kind of retrograde movement, which is taking us back to these more sort of atavistic ways of thinking where you think just in terms of identity, in terms of the tribe. You sort of don't remain open-minded. You sort of ostracize people who raise questions. Because I actually think that the Popperian way is actually quite, in many ways, is actually quite unnatural. Like I think we may have an inclination towards truth finding, but for whatever reason, we're not set up for falsification. We're not set up for statistics. We're not, you know, we're not set up for all of these things that we kind of now know that we should do if we want to get a good result.
I'm glad you said that because a lot of pop parents think it is natural. I don't. I find it uncomfortable often. I mean, you tend to slip a lot in language too. The words like verification, they slip into natural language and truth and knowledge and these kind of words that imply some sort of certainty in common parlance. They slip into language incredibly naturally. And it was in your article a few times when you said it is hard to get children to embrace something like critical rationalism. But it's not hopeless because there are cases in there where you tweak the classroom environment in certain ways and get them to work. I forget what the word is, cooperative engagement, where the kids, I think they get to choose their own topics. They get to work towards a certain outcome. And it seems to, at least from some of the examples in your article, there are ways to embed this into kids and get them to not just begin to have a more of a critical attitude, but actually to enjoy it as well and see the fun in it.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I think a lot of that section was written by Baptiste Foucault, the other co-author, and he actually did his PhD on philosophy for children, which I understand is a kind of wider movement. And there's empirical work on this as well, where they do interventions in the classroom where they try and teach kids critical rationality, and it sort of works surprisingly well, even though, we think of kids as, maybe I don't know what the right word is, but not fully rational, I suppose. I guess we're Aristotelians in that sense. But actually,
Hannah Arendt called them barbarians at the gates of civilization. She called
yeah,
them.
that's right.
Yeah,
The thing of kids is always kind of messing around
yeah,
and throwing things at each other and stuff.
yeah.
But no, apparently this can actually work pretty well. And Michael has also done this at Victoria University when we were still at Victoria University, basically just having very simple forms of kind of debate structure, but also sort of talking to the kids beforehand, students, university age students, about what they're trying to achieve. And yeah, he had this result that you mentioned there, where the first few times he said, okay, let's do a debate, and it's going to be completely open. Here are the rules of the game. Explains what an ad hominem is. When you attack the person rather than the argument. He says none of those. So some basic ground rules, and then he starts to talk about. He does a few of these sessions on non-controversial topics, relatively non-controversial topics, and then he's thinking, well, we'd never be able to do that if we talked about Maori issues or sex and gender or anything like that. But actually what he found was that several students would stay on after the class and say to him, oh, can we do this now for gender issues? Yeah. Can we do this now for racial issues? Because they actually wanted to talk about these things. And they thought, okay, this is a space where we can do this in a kind of civilized manner.
Yeah. Yeah. Before we get into the end of your article, there's one more point here about falsification I have in front of me. And that's the difference between universal statements and existential statements.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, so I didn't want to push through before we got to that. So let's get into that, because one is falsifiable and one is not. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's it. That's perfect, because that's the one thing I had in my notes that we haven't gotten to yet. And yeah, so this is the kind of thing it's kind of difficult to think about, and this is I sort of think this is probably why I didn't become a philosopher of science. It feels hard to me to think about these things, but. So I was trying to say to you earlier that I think that if you read a lot of what Popper wrote about falsification and falsifiability, there's a lot more flexibility to it than people think. And it's often about this attitude towards falsifiability. It's not just, is a proposition falsified or not falsified or whatever. However, it is also true to say that I think Popper, particularly early in his career, he had much more kind of logical and black and white versions of this thesis, which are quite sort of hardcore. And I think I think the main reason that people come out with this idea that Popper was all about falsification, science was just falsificationism, is just because it's simple. And I think that people, when they're doing a philosophy science course or whatever, if they're anything like me, they have in their notes, like, who is this Popper guy again? Oh yeah, falsification. He sort of comes out as the falsification guy. And it's semi-fair in that he did emphasize that. But, I'm trying to say that his theories are a bit more loose and there's more wiggle room in them than that. However, there are these statements of a kind of more pure and more logical way of looking at it. So logic of scientific discovery, I've written down this sentence. He says, a theory is falsifiable if the class of its potential falsifiers is not empty. So he's thinking about propositions, and, you have a proposition that something is the case, and then there's the class of potential falsifiers as the set of things which you might discover which would falsify those, or the set of things you might sort of come across which might falsify your basic proposition. That is not empty. In other words, there are examples of that. Another essay, he says, a statement or theory is falsifiable if and only if there exists one potential falsifier. So that's restatement of the same thing, right? There has to be some potential, there has to be some statement which would potentially falsify your theory. So that's, again, gets us back to thinking of, what would potentially falsify Freud's theories about the unconscious? What would potentially falsify theories about homeopathy or feng shui? And that's when you can kind of use this to sort of demarcate in the way that Popper wanted. But so in the logic of scientific discovery and other places as well, especially early on in his career, he has this sort of beautifully logical way of thinking about this, which I think is almost like too clean. And I'm just going to read, I have a passage from the Logic of Scientific Discovery, where he says, the theories of natural science, and especially what we call natural laws, have the logical form of strictly universal statements. Thus, they can be expressed in the form of negations of strictly existential statements, or as we may say, in the form of non-existent statements, or there is not statements. For example, the law of the conservation of energy can be expressed in the form, there is no perpetual motion machine, or the hypothesis of the electrical elementary charge in the form, there is no electrical charge other than a multiple of the electrical elementary charge. In this formulation, we see that natural laws might be compared to prescriptions or prohibitions. They do not assert that something exists or is the case, they deny it. They insist on the non-existence of certain things or states of affairs, proscribing or prohibiting, as it were, these things or states of affairs. They rule them out. And it is precisely because they do this that they are falsifiable. If we accept as true one singular statement which, as it were, infringes the prohibition by asserting the existence of a thing or the occurrence of an event ruled out by the law, then the law is refuted. An instance would be, in such and such a place, there is an apparatus which is a perpetual motion machine. Strictly existential statements, by contrast, cannot be falsified. No singular statement, that is to say, no basic statement, no statement of an observed event, can contradict the existential statement. There are white ravens, for example. Only a universal statement could do this. On the basis of the criterion of demarcation here adopted, I shall therefore have to treat strictly existential statements as non-empirical or metaphysical. Strict or pure statements, whether universal or existential, are not limited as to space and time. They do not refer to an individual restricted spatio-temporal region. This is the reason why strictly existential statements are not falsifiable. We cannot search the whole world in order to establish that something does not exist, has never existed, and will never exist. It is for precisely the same reason strictly universal statements are not verifiable. Again, we cannot search the whole world in order to make sure that nothing exists, which the law forbids. Nevertheless, both kinds of strict statements, strictly existential and strictly universal, are in principle empirically decidable. Each, however, in one way only. They are unilaterally decidable. Whenever it is found that something exists here or there, a strictly existential statement may therefore be verified, or a universal one falsified. The asymmetry here described, with its consequence, the one-sided falsifiability of the universal statements of empirical science, may now perhaps seem less dubious than it did before. Okay, so there's a lot in that, but and there's a lot going on about strict statements and stuff. But I guess so. One of the things I took away from this is just that he's talking about existential statements and universal statements, right? So if people listening have done elementary logic, it's the existential quantifier and the universal quantifier, right? It's the sort of backwards E or it's the upside down A. So there is such a thing, such as, and for all X, something is the case. So a statement like there is no swan, or there is no black swan, or there is a black swan. You're never going to be sure of that. You're never going to be able to prove that completely because you haven't searched the whole world. And in fact, this is what happened in European history, I believe, with black swans, right? That they thought, okay, there's none, but they didn't realize that Australia and New Zealand existed. Yeah. And then they found them. On the other hand, something like a universal statement such as all swans are white, all that needs to be falsified is one example of a black swan. Hell, you could even have an example of a pink swan. Any swan that was non-white, that would disprove that. So this is the asymmetry he's talking about. Existential statements, like basically impossible to prove for sure, because you can't search the whole universe as to whether something exists or not. But the universal ones, they have this sort of inbuilt bias, as it were, that they can actually be destroyed with a single counterexample. And so he seems to want to say early on in his career, like it's a beautifully kind of clear theory. He seems to want to say early on in his career that the universal statements are basically science. I mean, he sort of seems to imply early on, in my reading, that these are kind of coextensive with science. But then, as I say, very quickly, people complain, in his letters and his other articles and stuff, he very quickly kind of moves away from this position and starts to talk more about attitudes towards falsifiability and, the kind of thing that Baudry was talking about, whether people, of course, he thinks scientists, they can have things which seem to go against their theses and still be scientists. It's the question is whether they are open enough not to kind of double down for their whole lives. But yeah, there is actually early on in Popper something which looks like a very clean, a very kind of black and white logical account of falsifiability and falsification.
Yeah. Is this just looking at the time, let's rush back to your article for just a few things here that I think we haven't quite touched on before we get to the end of the time here. So I think one of the important points in this, and you must see this, I suppose, on university campuses as well, is I'm not sure if it's a fear, but it's a dislike of incrementalism. There's a certain flavor out there, it seems. People want dramatic, large change all the time. And of course, Popper has this piecemeal social engineering idea, but it doesn't seem to satisfy many people as a simple principle. And I see a lot of the debate these days about large encompassing policies, large encompassing movements, even revolution, things like this. And instead of I think what Popper is most important for, which is problem solving, find a problem and solve it, rather than finding 100 problems and trying to solve them with one policy.
Yeah, all life is problem solving, as you said.
Mm.
I think that's actually very good advice for PhD students as well, actually, is kind of like try and find a problem which is actually kind of a problem rather than just kind of like an intuition or like a mass of feelings about something. It's like, what can you actually sort of test? But yeah, no, I think that, yeah, definitely the past 5 years, maybe even a decade, I think it's been very much about we're certain that there is racial injustice, we're certain that there's sexual injustice, and we just have to kind of, we're certain that there's climate injustice, and we just have to sort of leap to changing things now. And in none of those cases, it's not that I think there's kind of no evidence for the idea that there's injustice or things are going wrong in any of those spheres. I think it's probably evidence that there are problems to solve in those areas. It's more just, as you say, the way that you look about going about solving these problems. And I just think that, again, this is something that we fail to learn from history, even though it's happened again and again. The episodes when people have been very sure what they need to change and the solutions have been most radical have generally not been the best ones for humanity. I mean, it's kind of going to sound very kind of reductive, but it is true. I mean, like the Pol Pot approach to public policy is probably not a good one. The idea that we're just going to completely kind of liquidate the bourgeoisie and start from scratch. And maybe no one's saying exactly that nowadays, but it might be something, pretty radical in other ways, that we're just going to transform society. And I think particularly around the freedom of speech, there's very much like we're going to sort of suspend that and we're just going to sort of force through these radical ideas. I mean, the risk, of course, is that you do a lot of harm. And I think that Popper here is very helpful because, so he doesn't talk about incrementalism per se. I don't think that's his term, but he definitely talks, as you say, about piecemeal social engineering in the open society and its enemies and in the poverty of historicism. And I think that idea is partly linked to his view of science, actually. It's this idea that, we're trying to look at what's actually important in these cases. And in science, we're trying to look at individual propositions and falsify them. And so, if we make experiments in society and change things, if we change one thing in a given year or two things, then we actually have a chance of, because things are very complicated, society is very complicated, then we actually have a chance of looking back and saying, oh, okay, that year we, raised the top tax rate by 1%, and it had the following results. And we can actually have some idea of what we've done and what the consequences were and how people felt about it. Or we could just, completely kind of rewrite everything. And not only would that be kind of dangerous because we don't really know how much trouble that would cause, but it's also very hard to then see kind of what we've done and what's been the thing that went wrong and what were the things that went right? Because all these things are bundled together. They're not sort of discrete changes and discrete propositions.
How much does you mentioned polarization a couple of times in the article. How much is polarization involved in that? I often think, I mean, you often look at America, of course, and you look at things like the immigration policy that both sides largely agree upon. And yet they're not solving each individual portion, which they clearly agree upon certain things in the factor. They're talking about comprehensive immigration policy to pass through the Senate and things like this. How much of an issue is the polarization that you see out there? I did listen to a few episodes, and I believe you spoke to Jonathan Haidt once, right? And
Yeah.
you referenced him a few times as well, and he goes into this in a lot of detail, but also the kind of harms it is doing to us as a society.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's a huge problem. And I think that probably does power a lot of these very radical statements and I think actually that's probably more the case now for the US right. I think that the kind of anti-woke reaction is relatively weak, I'd say, in us. Well, maybe Australia, it's a bit stronger. New Zealand, it's definitely much weaker. But I think that some of that is going to be salutary, but there's also a risk of going too far. And I think we see that definitely in the States. And I think that the right-wing response, especially in the States, strikes me as kind of driven by a lot of this polarization. So, it's like, well, abortion is one of those issues, apparently, that if you actually survey people, even in the United States, where it's quite polarized, it's like most people kind of say pragmatic things. They sort of think, yeah, there should be some abortion, there should be some limits on it, and they should be kind of reasonable. But then in the States, you often get this kind of, as I say, I think especially on the right now, you're passing these laws that basically make it very, very difficult to have any kind of abortion, even though most people probably don't want that. I think because they want to kind of stick it to the libs, right?
Mm.
And I think that's also, it's not great. I mean, if you stand back and think about that for just a second with your kind of rational mind, what you're doing is putting in place a policy in order to piss somebody off.
Yeah.
And these policies are going to affect lots of people. So you want to actually have policies that people are happy with and that, increase prosperity and freedom and equality and things like that, right? You don't want to just make policy out of your kind of FU system, the part of your brain which is involved in just sort of sticking the two fingers up to the man.
On that, I mean, we haven't touched on this either, but the idea of democracy as an epistemic system. So let's touch on that because that's really the core of the article that I have in front of me here, and this idea of feedback mechanisms. So in that situation, if politicians are passing policy and legislation that is not in line with their own populace, then a few things could be happening here, but they're certainly not getting the clear and accurate feedback that they should be getting. Because if they were, they'd be facing their own unelection in the next cycle. But so there's a clear analogy between Popper's work here, and he does it on purpose, particularly in the Openness Society as enemies, between democracy and science. So I might get you to take us there, but also that core aspect of feedback and information, which comes from the system itself.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so this idea that I actually opened with, of the idea that like falsification in science is kind of like politics for Popper. I mean, I don't know where he says that sort of very clearly, but he definitely thinks of democracy and he thinks of science in similar ways, at least. And I think early on in his work, he talks about sort of democracy is the only system where true science can be done, because you need freedom of speech as a condition of science, because you won't have access to all the propositions to falsify if you don't live in a democracy, I suppose is the idea. Later on, he kind of goes back to it, and there's this thing which Ian Jarvie and others have kind of pushed, which is the idea that at least late in his career, there was a kind of social turn in Popper. So again, like the kind of things that people say Popper didn't do, he actually, if you read him properly, I think he kind of starts to do himself. And one of them is to kind of focus on the social elements of science, really, and how that you can see rationality in science is inhering not only in an individual. In fact, I'll quote him just briefly here. It may be said, Popper writes, this is actually in the Open Society and its enemies, that what we call scientific objectivity is not a product of the individual scientist's impartiality, but a product of the social or public character of scientific method. And the individual scientist's impartiality is, so far as it exists, not the source, but rather the result of this socially or institutionally organized objectivity of science. So the kind of thing, so John Haidt founded this organization, Heterodox Academy, because he thought that the huge sort of left-wing slant within academia was making research worse. And I think one of his main intuitions there, his main insights there, was just the idea that we all have these cognitive bias, right? And one of them is my side bias. And so if we all have them and everyone is kind of on the same side politically, that will mean that in the academy, like a lot of ideas just aren't coming into the mix. And maybe they won't be true every time, but they'll sort of help the conversation and make it more objective and more scientific. And that's kind of not happening in the university. Jonathan Rauch, who actually was just in New Zealand, and he was on the Popperian podcast too.
Yeah.
So you talked about his book, The Constitution of Knowledge. Yeah. And that's a very interesting reading of kind of, the U.S. Republic alongside what he calls like a system of knowledge. What institutions do you need? What things do you need to happen in order to produce sort of good knowledge, good public knowledge? And I think that Rauch's vision is kind of more Republican. So in other words, he compares the ideal system of knowledge for him to what's happening in the U.S. political system, which is, the founders of the American system set it up so there are all these veto points. So basically things are going to get tested because, the Senate is separate from the House of Representatives and they're separate from the president, and they're all going to balance each other. Now, what we wanted to do in the article is just push that a little bit further. We think that's a really good intuition, but we wanted to sort of make it a little bit more democratic. So it's not just the case that you need these veto points at the sort of elite level. You also, I think, need just a lot of feedback. It's more like a network. You want input from lots and lots of different human beings. You want everything to sort of feed into the system. It doesn't mean that like everything any human being, any individual human being says is correct. It just means that it'll be better for science if all these inputs go into the system, go into the discussion. And at some point you have some kind of deliberation, which obviously weeds out the weaker ideas. But yeah, that's basically the idea. And one other reference I should note there is actually Hayek, who was a friend of Popper. Although I think Popper in some ways kind of kept him at arm's length after a certain point. I think that Hayek actually offered to write a preface for the Open Society and its enemies, but Popper says something in a letter like, I thought that he would brand my work, and I didn't want this to happen. But actually, so Hayek is often seen as kind of like libertarian right, but one of Hayek's basic ideas is that information is something that's important to have flow from everybody. This is what he thinks about price. He thinks that the price mechanism is a beautiful example of how inputs from lots of different human beings can lead to a particular result. You know, all these inputs about the supply and demand of shoes, it then is beautifully compressed when you go into the shoe shop to the individual prices of all the shoes. And that happens in a kind of magical cooperative way, which wouldn't happen as efficiently if you had planners. And that's kind of his point about if you have a planned society, like an extreme example like the Soviet Union, where you just have like someone deciding how many pairs of shoes you need, the result is, as we saw in the 70s and 80s, is that, you know, you actually don't get good provision of goods. You know, you don't get enough of some things and you get too much of other things. And so that's also part of this idea that we had of democracy as itself a kind of epistemic system.
How much of that is, and I do like them. I do like Hayek, and I do like those quotes of his. How much of it is um, I don't use the word elitist, but I suppose it's quite fashionable these days. But elitist mistrust of the population itself. Now, I think one of the Popper's best ideas about democracy is that social idea as it applies to science, where everyone has local knowledge. Everyone has something that they know a lot about in their small community, and they know what problems they have in their life. Now, that may not manifest itself to the larger scale, but you do need to listen to what those particular problems are. And if you ignore them, they're simply not going to vote for you themselves there. So I wonder this is one of those challenging systems where there seems to be a lot of people out there in the world who think that some people's views are simply not worth listening to because of not just ideological capture, but they say something foolish and they say, well, this person is not worth listening to. They don't have enough education to properly participate within a democracy, without seeing that they do know some very specific things that you don't, because they have a life of problems that you don't have.
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's the spirit. I mean, I think that's the democratic spirit for me, the liberal democratic spirit. Just sort of listen to people. I mean, that's the way the system is set up. I mean, I often think that, you know, market liberals talk about signals coming from choice in the market. I think that's a very good thing, but they often justify that as saying, well, this is the common people's choice. And I think that is actually kind of a good way of justifying it. But obviously the same applies to democracy. You know, people are inputting what they know about the world. And as you say, in some cases, it's not going to be perfectly accurate. But in a lot of cases, they will, because they're humans and they're incentivized to know things about their environment, they will know some things that you don't, even if it's just like what it's like to live in the tip of Northland, New Zealand, or the bottom of the South Island, right? And I mean, you and I probably both know, I mean, I spent years studying Greek and Latin. I know a lot about Latin and Greek poetry, but, you know, by virtue of the fact that I spent so much time doing that, there are lots of things that I don't know how to do, right? If you put me on a farm in Southland, I would seem ignorant. I would, you know, be completely incapable of doing most of the things that the average farmer in that region, you know, does every day before breakfast. So I think that that's the kind of really humble part of the democratic idea is that we actually always have something to learn from others. And I think that, yeah, Popper, this is part of the reason I like him. I think, you know, he had a reputation as a very cantankerous man, but I think at bottom, I think there's still the idea that, you know, we should be open-minded. You can be wrong. Everyone can be wrong, and we need to sort of learn from each other.
So I've kept you a little longer than I said I would, but as a final question here, and this, it's one of those broad, uncomfortable final questions that are hard to answer. But how do you see this going forward here? So you talk a lot in the article about things like psychological fragility that you see out there within the society itself, and it's hard to properly at least for me, it's hard to properly see these things, whether it's real psychological fragility or whether it's always been a fragile society and we're simply imagining a glorious past where we weren't. It's not the easiest thing to see, but there certainly seems to be a range of new problems emerging within the universities and the education system that weren't there when we were younger. So I wonder how your article is a look to the future in some ways and some of the changes that we'd want to implement within society. So how would we go about making some of the beginning changes and being to turn the tide on this thing and get it going in a better direction?
It's very tough. I mean, it's hard to know what to think of the future. And I think people who make predictions, they often kind of seem like cranks, and maybe I'll be no exception to that. But I'm very pessimistic at this point about our mainstream institutions, to be honest, and that immediately makes me sound like a crank. But I saw a survey the other day, though, in New Zealand that I can't remember the exact figure, but I think it was a majority of New Zealanders now feel that the mainstream media is biased, even though that's often presented as a kind of conspiracy theory or something completely crazy. I mean, I don't think that, Radio New Zealand or something is all completely wrong, or that they're conspiring to kind of feed us falsehoods or something. I just think that there's this substantial political bias. And I think that the universities also have this problem. And it comes about in very kind of normal ways without requiring any special conspiracy. It's just that, people tend to associate with people that are like them. And I think that this kind of builds up over time and it starts to spiral. And so I think that the universities and the media are probably going to continue to get worse just because there are all these selection effects. And the more people who think differently that you get rid of, the more it kind of strengthens that inclination to only keep people who believe one type of thing. However, I'm more optimistic about new media, and I'm also more optimistic about the internet at this point. I mean, I think that social media has caused a lot of these problems, or it has fed in substantially to some of these problems. I think John Haidt believes that as well. But I'm more optimistic now than I was, that I think that we're beginning to understand how these things work. We're more attuned to the fact that it's not just that you sort of let people say things online and everything will go hunky-dory. You also have to think very carefully about how your social media site is set up and the kind of things it allows and it disallows, how the algorithms work. And I think that also more people are going online. I think for a long time it was more the preserve of a certain set, a certain elite. And I think that that's also a healthy thing. And so my hope is that we're going to be able to develop institutions in the future that are going to be healthier in terms of what Jonathan Rauch calls this constitution of knowledge. And that this is actually going to get us past a lot of those problems if we think about it carefully and we make sure that we're being as sort of open-minded as possible. We're open to falsification, and we're also taking inputs from as broad a section of the population as possible. Because if you don't, people just get alienated.
Do you think long-term those institutions are doing themselves a tremendous amount of harm, though? So short-term, they're not listening to the feedback mechanisms from the broader society if those polls are going the way that you said they are. So short-term, they're going to, compact in and simply double down on what they're doing. But long-term, like a dictatorship that's not listening to the population, groundswell builds, and eventually the whole thing cracks open at some point.
Well, I mean, what does that look like? I mean, I really hope and I trust. I don't think it's going to be the case that it comes to something really crazy like civil war. I think that that's almost certainly not going to happen in New Zealand or Australia. I think that it's sort of more on the cards in the United States than it has been for the rest of our lifetimes. I still think it's not a likely situation, but I wouldn't rule it out at this point. If, say, Trump wins a presidency again and then he gets voted out, but he tries to stay. I don't know what would happen in that case. I think that's kind of a scary thought. So, so hopefully that won't happen. But, sorry, what was the
about the long-term harm the institutions might perhaps do to themselves? So short-term, they're clearly not listening to the feedback mechanisms they should be listening to. But long-term, this will surely do them a larger harm if you don't listen to those feedback mechanisms.
Yeah, that's the thing. So I think that it's crazy as well. I often think with the universities, I think any sort of time they could have chosen to sort of double down on just being stubborn about, no, we're the kind of left-wing elite and these are the views that you have to kind of participate in the university. This is the worst time in history to do that, because there are all these alternative mechanisms. Like if they and they did a little bit in the past, but I think if you do this kind of thing in the 70s or 80s, it's kind of like, well, there's nowhere else to go. There aren't any big we need to have access to books, and the universities kind of can hoard them in these big libraries, and everyone educated is kind of at the university. Like now, that's just not the case. There's sort of many more ways of getting information and things like that. So I think that they've really shot themselves in the foot, and I don't think that they're going to completely collapse anytime soon. I think that they still have one big draw card, which is that a university degree as a credential has a lot of power. Like people will still employ you based on you having a university degree in the way that they won't if you've passed like a Udemy course or watched a lot of YouTube videos. But I think my prediction is even that will change. I think that sort of online providers will get much better at that, and over time there'll be more trust in credentials gained outside of universities. So I actually think this is the kind of thing, again, it's going to sound like I'm a crank, but I actually think that sort of long or even medium term, the universities are going to decline in terms of their influence on public life. And maybe in 40 or 50 years, they're just going to be a much sort of, it's especially kind of going and getting a BA, I think is going to be a much rarer thing. And it'll be more some combination of technical training at universities and really kind of good online education that people are going to go for. And the media is going to be, there's going to be an even faster transformation towards that kind of thing. Like there are going to be some particularly kind of nimble state-funded media that manage to survive. Like maybe the BBC will be able to reform itself and do a good job of keeping some part of the market. But I think its influence on British public life is going to be much smaller. The level of trust it enjoys is going to be much smaller. And, most people are going to, I think it's already the case that a lot of people get their news from social media, and that's just going to continue.
Yeah. That's a good note to end the podcast on as well. So the article I've been reading, it's not published yet. This is a preprint I have, right?
Oh, no, it's out now, yeah.
Oh, it's out. Okay, well, I'll do my best to put a link below the podcast as well, even though we didn't touch on most of the article itself, but I do encourage people to go and read it for themselves. And I'll also put a link, of course, to the Free Kiwis podcast where people can go listen and listen along with me each week. And I learn each week about all the things I'm doing badly on my podcast by listening to James's podcast. So I do encourage people.
I've just binged several episodes of the Popperian podcast too, so that if people are more interested in this topic, that boundary one is very good. And the Elliot Sober one about falsification as well.
Yeah.
Listen to that. And so, lots of good episodes.
Well, I appreciate it. And it's always a pleasure to have you on. So this is the third time. If you publish anything else in the future, please send it through. And I know people will be interested in listening to you. James Kierstead, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.